So now we're going to look at the second exam question. So again, this is a 30-minute question. It's asking you to look at some numbers about market share. It's asking you to make a calculation of 4-firm concentration ratio, Herfindahl-Hirschman index. It's proposing a change in the division of market shares, asking you to recalculate. So both of those sections have got 10 marks. So remember, it's important to give methodology as well as your answer. Second part is asking you to discuss. The first part is asking you to comment. So this is making a calculation, but it's also requiring you to think about industry structure, which you've investigated as part of your portfolio research into a specific industry. If there are 8 firms, what kind of industry structure do you expect? Why would electricity generation have relatively few players? So you can talk about costs, talk about infrastructure. Part 3 of the question is a smaller subsection, only 5 marks available, so it's less important, but it's asking you to think about regulation and relate it to mergers. So it's very common for regulation to be brought into questions that are about industry structure. So particularly in the context of your own industry study, whether it was clothing manufacturer, chemicals, brewing, has there been any relevant regulation? So turning to point part A of this question, we want to look at the 4-firm concentration ratio. So remember, a concentration ratio is just the sum of the market share of the 4 biggest. Remember, if it was a 5-firm, it would be the 5 biggest. So we just take the information that we're given here. Luckily, they've been written in order of size. So to get the 4-firm concentration, it's just the sum of the biggest 4 firms' market share. So it's 28%, 13%, 9%, 8%, 58%. So then we have to interpret it, thinking back to the tables we had in the lecture notes for lecture 10. And I don't have it in front of me, but my memory suggests that this would be a loose oligopoly. Does that make sense? Well, we had 8 players, so it's obviously an oligopoly of some description. So a loose oligopoly intuitively makes sense. Next, we have to make the Herfindahl-Hirschman calculation. Remember, that's slightly more complicated. Here's one I prepared earlier. So you take the market shares and you turn them into decimals. You have to use the information on every firm that you're given. So every firm is relevant, and that's one of the big differences between HHI and concentration ratio, and you square them. So essentially you just take each one, square it, and then you find the sum. So we have 0.1241, which could also be written as 12.41, depending on how we present the information. If we think back to the tables that we had again in lecture 10 to look at interpreting the result of this calculation, this tells us it is a perfectly competitive industry structure. So to get all full 10 marks, we have to take what we've learned about concentration ratio, 58% loose oligopoly, HHI index, perfect competition, and we have to make sense of this contradiction. Very often with a question like this about market shares, mergers and acquisitions and regulation, the numbers are selected to be contradictory. So to get the full 10 marks, you've got to explain it. And the obvious thing to do is to say, intuitively, if there are 8 firms, it's not perfectly competitive. Intuitively, power generation is an industry that has heavy infrastructure, which requires investment, which means barriers to entry. You're not going to enter and exit the industry easily. In terms of what we learned about minimum efficient scale, it's likely you need to produce a high amount of total demand for electricity to lower your average costs. So loose oligopoly intuitively makes more sense. Part B. A newcomer, Feast Power, wants to buy the largest and the smallest firm. So it wants EDF, which had 28% of the market share, and it wants to buy CDF Engie, which had 3%. So if we think about the recalculations, it's fairly obvious what it does to the 4-firm calculation. The 4-firm concentration ratio becomes 31%, the new biggest firm in the industry, plus 13% the next, 9% the next, 8% the next. So we end up with a 4-firm concentration ratio of 61%. It's very similar to our previous result, and this is because we're only taking information about the 4 biggest firms, and the largest firm has gone from having 28% to 31% of market share. So we're still looking at a relatively loose oligopoly if we interpret this figure using the tables from the lecture. Now we need to recalculate the HHI. So our new firm, Feast Power, has 31% market share, and this is how we calculate it. So 0.31 squared gives us 0.0961. If we then plug this in with the other firm's information, we end up with an HHI value of 0.1409 or 14.09, depending on how we're choosing to write them. And again, this suggests to us that it's a perfectly competitive industry. So let's think intuitively about that. We started off in an electricity generating industry with 8 firms. We're proposing to move to a position where there are 7 firms. There is no way that this can be considered perfectly competitive. We've talked before about the importance of relating our discussion to the specific good or service provided. Electricity generation cannot be a perfectly competitive industry. So using our intuition, we say oligopoly is a more likely explanation of the industry. An additional point is on offer if we remember that this is the UK industry, and in the UK, mergers and acquisitions which will result in a market share greater than 25% are routinely investigated to look at the impact on consumers and potentially other stakeholders. So in a UK context, it's highly unlikely that this firm would be able to enter the industry and acquire both of these, giving it a market share of 31%. So unlikely to happen. The final part of the question requires you to have done some specific research around regulation. So you could use any potential case that you're familiar with. It could be investigation that we looked at briefly in lecture 10 of the proposed merger between AB InBev and SAB Miller, which led to regulatory intervention by the EU. It could be something that you looked at in the context of your industry portfolio. But to gain the 5 marks that are available here, you're needing to write for roughly 8 minutes. So you'd expect to have a short paragraph of maybe 5 sentences about regulation. If you don't have a specific case, if all you can offer is some conceptual explanation of why regulation might be important, if you just related it back to the concept of welfare, if you talked about the stakeholders who might be impacted by the merger, it's possible that you could gain 1 or 2 marks, but for the 5 marks, you must have specific recent example to finish the question. And that's the end of question 2.